Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Tuesday, May 28th, and we officially have our first team in the NBA Finals. Last night, the Celtics completed the sweep of the Indiana Pacers in 4 games. So we're going to be diving into that game, some of the bigger picture questions here for the Celtics as they head into the finals, and some of the keys to the series for them. We're also going to be looking at the offseason ahead for the Indiana Pacers, who just ultimately, obviously it's disappointing seeing the way that they sort of handed away, it seemed like, some of these games. 3 of the matchups in this series against a much better team, and you can make an argument that they played better than the Celtics in some of these instances, and yet they lose all 3 of the close matchups and are now headed home. But there's a lot to feel good about for them, so we are going to look ahead to their offseason and talk about whether or not they could find themselves back in the conference finals anytime soon. We are also going to be talking about some other playoff action from last night in the NHL, where we saw the Dallas Stars pull off a little bit of a comeback of their own to take a 2-1 series lead against the Edmonton Oilers. And then finally, we're going to be wrapping up the show. There were some reports that came out about the Clippers negotiation process with Paul George, so we will provide some updates on where that currently stands. But before we dive into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Help us grow the channel. To any of our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. And if you want to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a comment, and your comment will pop up on the screen. Again, try and make this show as interactive as possible. Anything would be greatly appreciated. First off, we do have to cover the Celtics winning this Game 4 matchup against the Pacers, officially sweeping Indiana. They win 105-102, and what was another it was a really fun game. I know that there are a lot of people who are calling this series boring, but I just don't see it that way whatsoever. Seeing the heart that the Pacers played with throughout this series, and especially once they were undermanned when Tyrese Halliburton left the game in the second game, they continued to fight. Andrew Nembhard looks to be a real promising piece for them moving forwards, coming off of his sophomore year. So you have to give credit to the Pacers, but ultimately the Boston Celtics, when you looked at the competition in the rest of the Eastern Conference, it seemed like it was just about always theirs to lose, and they are coming out pretty much unscathed, where they lost just 2 games throughout the course of the series, finished their Eastern Conference run here 12-2, and did so in pretty dominant fashion for the most part. And this is something that, these past Celtics teams, we talked about this yesterday, have sort of lacked the maturity to not play around with their food. We talked about last year the fact that the Atlanta Hawks, who were severely worse than the Celtics, where they end up pushing it to 6 games. The Celtics had to pull off a series comeback against a 76ers team. That series should have never went 7, and they end up losing to, on paper, a worse Miami Heat team. But they just took care of business throughout this entire Eastern Conference run so far. And yes, you can absolutely talk about the injuries to the other teams, but you know what? The Celtics did what they had to. And yes, they played some close games in this series, and especially in those last 2 games, felt like they shouldn't have necessarily been behind as much as they were in either of those 2 matchups. But Indiana came into this series undefeated at home. That atmosphere there in the Pacers crowd is phenomenal, and their players stepped up. But at the end of the day, the Celtics were just the better team, and we're going to get into the Pacers side of this later in the show. But The Celtics end up winning, and it is Jaylen Brown who was named the Eastern Conference Finals MVP, deservingly so. He was incredible all the way throughout, and in this game in particular, we once again saw that sort of killer mentality from Jaylen Brown down the stretch, where he was initiating a lot of the offense. Just in game 3, we saw it was Jason Tatum sort of as the motor, and I wouldn't say it's quite to, the individual creation level of a Luka Kyrie situation where they almost go sort of possession for possession with one another. But the Celtics have multiple guys who can lead them in the fourth quarter. Last night it was Jaylen Brown, finishes with 29 points, 6 rebounds, and made some absolutely massive defensive plays down the stretch of this game where he ended up blocking Andrew Nembhard. He stripped Pascal Siakam on, again, some really impactful defensive moments there. But then on offense as well, he hits the game-tying shot to even it up at 102 apiece. And then in the final minute of the game, he is the one who sort of takes it down the court himself, drives into the paint, kicks out to Derek White, who knocks down the game-winning 3. Quickly on Derek White, by the way, May 27th, 2023, 1 year to the day of last night's game, was the sort of his first big Celtics moment where he had the game-winning putback shot against the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals last year. So just kind of funny how, 365 days apart, Derek White making these big plays for the Celtics in these big moments. And he was 1 of 8 from 3 up to that point. He had even just missed a 3 in the prior minute up to this game winner. But he just feels like he's somebody who is always so reliable for this Celtics team whenever they need to come up big. He is the one who gets it done. But Jaylen Brown, again, completely deserving for him. Was awesome to see him get this type of honor, especially after, this past week, all NBA teams were released and Jaylen Brown was left off of them. I think that he had a great case. I'm not going to say it was complete robbery, but he was on the, ballot, at least in my eyes, and he was phenomenal throughout this series. He, of course, had the game-tying shot in Game 1 that kept them alive, and they were able to pull that one out. He scored 40 points in Game 2, and ultimately in this game, like I said, he was the engine. He had a little bit of a slow start offensively in this Game 4 matchup, but ultimately he produced, and the series as a whole, 29.8 points per game, 51.7 from the field, 37% from 3, averaged 2 steals per game. Again, can't speak enough about his defense, and he at least had a quote about that's sort of where he was more frustrated that he wasn't on an all defensive team. I think that it's awesome to see the level of pride that he takes on that end of the floor nowadays. Now, I don't think that he had as strong of a case for that as he did for all NBA, but regardless, he absolutely showed up on that defensive side of the floor, and it was just, like I said, it felt like the Celtics team is just so connected, and we've seen Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum talking about this idea of sacrifice all throughout the season, and Jaylen Brown understanding that offensively he may not be asked quite as much. He really locked in on that defensive side of the ball, and it was great to see. And it feels like a lot of people are going to try and turn this into a Jaylen Brown versus Jason Tatum thing. Nelson of the basketball podcast was already sort of trying to mess with me last night, sending some texts about whether or not Jaylen Brown is better than Jason Tatum. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This team seems all in on trying to win this championship, and you know what? Drew Holiday also could have gotten some love for an Eastern Conference Finals MVP as well. The way that he played, 18.5 points per game, 7 rebounds, 5.8 assists, 59 and 42 shooting splits. He was tremendous, as well as having the game-sealing plays in games 3 and 4 with the steal against Nembhard in 3, and he grabbed that offensive rebound to be able to dribble out the clock last night. So He was incredible. And, to this idea of sacrifice, I definitely wouldn't say that Jason Tatum sacrificed in this series, not winning the MVP necessarily, but it's good, like we talk about with Luka and Kyrie, that he has somebody that he knows he can defer to a little bit, and then he doesn't have to carry everything on his shoulders. That being said, still put up incredible stats throughout this series: 30.2 points per game, 10.3 rebounds per game, especially last night was coming away with some crucial ones where we understand the Celtics, especially with Kristaps Porzingis injured, but even when he is in the game, Tatum is their best rebounder, and he was incredible doing so last night and in all of these big moments throughout the series. 6.3 assists per game as well. Finally got to see his efficiency rising again, 46.3% from the field, and shot over 30% from three. So a much better Jason Tatum series. Seems like he's sort of rearing his head at the right time headed into the finals. And again, a lot of people are going to sort of make this into a conversation within the team itself, but ultimately, Tatum, Horford, everybody seemed thrilled for Jaylen Brown that he was able to take home the MVP award, and now it's on to bigger things. So, ultimately for this game, I do think that when you look at the way that they were able to sort of once again win one of these close matchups, and listen, we all understand that the Celtics are the better team than the Pacers. They shouldn't drop any of these games, but they didn't. And just the fact that the Pacers competed, I think, is a statement on the Pacers. Now, we're going to be diving into some of the questions surrounding the Celtics in the next segment, but at least sort of spinning it in a positive light, at least for now. These are games that, specifically 1 and 3, I talked about this yesterday, that those aren't games that the Celtics traditionally pull out, that we have seen them drop in the past, and they come up big, at least, this time around. Now, level of competition is about to take a step up in the next round, but this was a really competitive game where the Pacers were playing desperate and they were playing well. The largest lead by either team was the Pacers by 9 points, and they put together that lead late. But once again, the Celtics, it seems like, at least in this series, and again, this is a conversation that we're going to sort of dive into in terms of how this looks in the finals, the level of execution, I'm sure, from assuming it is a Mavericks matchup, is going to be much higher than in a Tyrese Halliburton-less Indiana Pacers team. But the defensive intensity down the stretch of these games was just so massive for the Celtics. They hold the Pacers scoreless in the final 3 minutes and 33 seconds of this game, and that's ultimately what leads them to this win. So again, this is a team that really can do everything. Again, there are some concerns that we're going to be diving into very shortly, but ultimately, this is everything you could have asked from the Celtics during this Eastern Conference run. And on that note, we're going to be sort of diving into what is next for them when the NBA Finals come around and what that matchup is going to look like for them. So we are going to be taking our first break of the show here, and when we come back on the other side, going to be diving into the biggest questions about the Celtics headed into the finals. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that sound, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. lift off. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, and we're now going to be talking about the biggest questions surrounding the Celtics, of course, wrapping up the finals appearance last night, but the battle does not stop there. This is pretty much where the season starts almost for the Celtics, because in many people's eyes, it was championship or bust for them, especially the way that the Eastern Conference broke out. They were expected to be in this position, so they do still have some level of proving themselves to be done, and they are going to be facing off against likely the most difficult team that they have had to throughout this postseason run so far. As things currently stand, it looks like it's going to be the Mavericks, who have a 3-0 series lead over the Timberwolves. Now game 4 is tonight, Tuesday night, so we could have an official answer by tomorrow as to who the Celtics are going to be playing. But I think biggest thing with them is what is the status of Kristaps Porzingis, who he left during their Game 2 matchup. I believe it was Game 2 or Game 3 against the Miami Heat in the first round. And they have done a great job up to this point of being able to sort of roll on without him. And they've gotten some key Al Horford games since then to be able to sort of stay alive. But the fact of the matter is, it's clear that Missoula understands they need to sort of supplement him with somebody else. Al Horford is going to be turning 38, I want to say, just before the final starts. I can double check that as we speak, but in the coming week, he is going to be turning June 3rd. He turns 38 years old. Finals start on June 6th. So, it's a lot of pressure to be putting on somebody who is as experienced as Al is, and again, can still give you really good performances, but ultimately, throwing him out there for 35 minutes a game, especially if they were to play against the Dallas Mavericks, having to guard Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, that is a huge ask. So it's 10 days rest for the Celtics until the finals start. Kristaps Porzingis hopefully can take some extra time to sort of work his way back here. Now, it is definitely concerning that up to this point we haven't seen him running these practices with his team still, and that he's doing individual stuff. He's at least on the court now, but it doesn't seem super optimistic up to this point. Now, we'll have some more updates. Adrian Wojnarowski, he said that the soonest Porzingis would return was Game 4. Ultimately did not. Again, still hasn't practiced full on with the team, but I do feel like to some degree that has to do with the fact that the Celtics took the kind of lead that they did against the Pacers, understood that he probably wasn't necessary for that series, but he's going to be needed for the finals, where I think with both the Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks, I find it really hard to believe, truthfully, that the Celtics can win without him. But when we get a definitive answer on who they're going to be playing, we will sort of break down that matchup more particularly. But I think that ultimately sort of the ripple effect from this, as well as the fact that Al Horford is starting for them, like we mentioned, and that is one less person off of the bench that they can really rely on. Because throughout that Pacers series in the Eastern Conference Finals, we saw that the Pacers were able to get this spark off of the bench every single time they came in, and the Celtics just didn't necessarily have that same sort of energy plug. And keep in mind, the Pacers, one of the best bench units in the NBA. I thought that was just about, you can say injuries as well, but in terms of sort of the players on the court, I think that the bench energy that the Pacers got against the Knicks was the biggest reason for them being able to win that series, because there was a clear differential between those two teams. And again, Celtics ultimately are able to overcome it because they were healthier, especially in that starting lineup. But a bench unit struggled for them in a lot of this series. And, Sam Hauser, who is somebody who they relied on for three-point shooting and offense off of the bench, he was just 1 of 14 from 3 in the Eastern Conference Finals. Maybe that's something that he can bounce back. Hauser fights on defense. He's no liability, as much as, I love Peyton Pritchard and some of the offense and spark plug that he can bring. His work on the offensive boards can't go unnoticed. The fact that at his size, he works harder than just about everyone. But I do think because of his size, the defensive aspect of this, and he just feels like somebody that Luka Doncic would repeatedly go after if they were to face off against the finals, the way that Jimmy Butler did in the Eastern Conference Finals last year. But those are really the three guys that they were relying on in the playoffs for them, or during off the bench for the majority of the regular season. And, if Hauser can't shoot and Pritchard can't play defense, you're looking at a very skinny, 7-man rotation. And that's going to be a really hard job to put up with, again, the Mavericks, if that's who they play. I keep alluding to them and saying that we're not going to fully dive into that matchup until we actually have results. But, ultimately, I do think that the bench is going to be a question for the Celtics. Now, again, having all of this rest, we can see if Hauser can maybe sort of settle down, get his shot back, and he could be a massive piece for them. Peyton Pritchard, by the way, didn't talk about this in the first segment, but the foot that he caught to the face of Isaiah Jackson, where I don't think it was anything malicious, but he had basically a shoe print on his face through that game, which was, not like... because he's okay, it's kind of funny, but looked crazy in the moment. I'm sure he's embracing it. But, been talking about sort of the bench units, and that does sort of bring me into the next question for the Celtics, which is if Andrew Nembhard and TJ McConnell are sort of carving up this Celtics defense, what do you think that some of these, elite perimeter players from the Western Conference, Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, how are they going to do against the Celtics when the finals come around? Now, I think the Celtics, especially if it is that Mavericks matchup, is going to try and throw maybe a little bit more size at the star players, where it was mostly Derek White and Drew Holiday. Drew Holiday also was questionable headed into both games 3 and 4 with an illness, so that's something that he can likely overcome in the next week plus to, be a little bit more refreshed headed into a final series where his matchup would likely be an elite point guard. But I think that, the idea of, I feel like the Celtics are going to shuffle around the types of different looks that they throw out there, but Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum putting some more length, especially if you're looking at an Anthony Edwards or a Luka Doncic, there's never going to be a perfect player to guard them, but that can sort of be the, at least, best case scenario. Jaden McDaniels is long, but he is also skinny. I think that, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown do have a little bit more weight to them as well, a little bit more muscle, and that is, I definitely wouldn't say stout, but having that little bit of extra size and muscle is how you can at least sort of not get pushed around by Luka, because he's just so good at sort of using his body to create space for these jumpers that he's automatic with. But, that is definitely a concern for the Celtics, and sort of all of this bakes into, well, have the Celtics had such an easy time up to this point? Could that actually pose a problem for them in terms of not being prepared with quite the same level of intensity? I don't know if I would go that far, because, again, they had to play in a lot of these close matchups throughout the postseason, specifically talking about this series against the Indiana Pacers, having 3 of the 4 games come as these very close matchups down the stretch of regulation. And I think that sort of, amps up the intensity headed into it. Now, they're going to have some time to cool off, obviously, until the finals start. But I do think that, call it a wake-up call. They did sort of have that call to action, you could call it, in this Eastern Conference Finals series. And it's going to be interesting because one of the biggest concerns that we've had with the Celtics throughout the past few seasons is the idea of their clutch offense. Do they still have the sort of guys that can move the ball around, get good shot looks, and actually convert in these situations? Seemed like their pace slowed down a lot, and it was a lot of ISO ball, but it was sort of the opposite of that, especially games 3 and 4, you could see that. So that was really encouraging to see. But if you are going to be facing off against a Mavericks team that was the number one clutch offense in the league during the regular season, it's going to get harder, and that level of execution is going to have to be that much higher. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section, what your biggest concern with the Celtics is heading into this final series. And we will continue to preview this series as we get more details about who they're playing and as the sort of storylines begin to emerge about what is going to take place in the finals. But we're going to be taking our second break now, and when we come back on the other side, want to dive into the Pacers, a little bit of a reflection of their season, but what their top priorities should be in the coming offseason. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Now headed into our next segment, where we are going to look at the Pacers side of this following their sweep in the Eastern Conference Finals. And like we talked about, this is a great accomplishment for the Pacers, sort of getting out ahead of schedule and being able to put together this type of run. And I know that a lot of people have been sort of disrespectful almost to the Pacers, that also saying, because the Pacers were a team just like the Celtics, did benefit a lot from some key injuries to opposing players, but ultimately, their run also does sort of end with Tyrese Halliburton going out. Now, I don't think the Pacers were ever going to beat the Celtics in this series, but, a lot to feel good about here if you are a Pacers fan. And we'll sort of talk about the idea of whether or not they can return to this conference finals in the coming years. But looking at their offseason, the number one priority for them should be to re-sign Pascal Siakam to a new contract. He is going to be a free agent this summer, and I think you can definitely make an argument that he was the Pacers' best player during the postseason. Now, obviously, him or Halliburton, both were really good for them for the most part, but I thought Siakam was probably a little bit more consistent on some occasions. And again, not that you have to pin one against the other, but just to say how important Siakam was for this Pacers team. And he was just a matchup nightmare, it felt like, for the majority of it. The Bucks had no idea how to guard him at the beginning of that series. And even then, you go into the Knicks series, they were trying to throw Josh Hart at him, and Siakam was just rising up over him. And it felt like, again, that sort of short, mid-range shot he was just automatic with. So I thought that he was really impressive. They obviously traded for him at the deadline in February, And they didn't have to ultimately give up all too much. It was 2 first-round picks in this year's draft, which is seen as one of the weaker ones in history. I believe that it is pick number 19, which comes from them directly, and then I think they had control of the 29th overall pick as well, which is headed to Toronto as well. A conditional 2026 pick. I'm not sure exactly what the protections are there. And Bruce Brown and Jordan Nwora. So really not too much as a whole. So it wouldn't be like they gutted their roster to go get this guy that if he were to leave, it would be, this disaster. But I think that the Pacers should be all about trying to get Siakam back. They are obviously not a top-tier free agent market in Indiana, and it seems like Pascal Siakam really wants to return. The reporting up to this point is that he is excited about potentially trying to work out a new deal with them. I think he's a great fit for them, the fast pace that they play and sort of some of the length that they can throw out there as well. I would really like to see him and Halliburton get some more years together to sort of develop their game a little bit more. I think there are some fun possibilities with that two-man game. And, ultimately, the Pacers are trying to build themselves up towards being a prominent Eastern Conference Finals team. And they have a lot of youth talent right now, that this is the veteran that they can, hopefully sort of get that experience under. Now, Pascal Siakam is going to be somebody that is sought after from other teams, especially in somewhat of a weaker free agency class. We have heard some rumors from the Pistons going after him, the 76ers, the Magic, and the Knicks all could try and make some plays for him. But I do expect him to be back in Indiana. It sounded like that was something that even when they made the deal for him at the deadline, that they were sort of going to revisit this during free agency, and that's when they were going to get their deal done. So that's my expectations. Outside of Siakam, the Pacers are pretty set headed into this offseason in terms of being able to control their assets. Obi Toppin is the only other real significant free agent, and he is restricted. Going to be interesting to see whether or not they choose to ride with him, because he provided a really nice spark off of the bench for them throughout the playoffs as a whole. I would say that, he made some nice defensive plays, obviously, in that Game 4 matchup. Seemed like the Celtics made it a little bit of a priority around that 3-minute mark when Joe Mazzulla called his use it or lose it timeout, that they were going to try and go at Obi Toppin a little bit more, which is something that, obviously has been a red flag for him. But as a 6-man, I don't think that it would be unreasonable at all for them to match an offer sheet. I can't imagine Obi Toppin is getting any sort of ridiculous contract offer this offseason, but we'll see. Ultimately, he is expendable, but I also think that that's a guy sort of like Siakam, has the length, has the high energy potential, able to run the court. He is a good fit there in Indiana, and I would like to see him back there. But as for the bigger picture question here, can the Pacers expect to be back in the conference finals for years to come? Now, we have seen, individual instances where these conference finals runs can be, I don't want to say phony, but sort of, a little bit fraudulent, where the Atlanta Hawks in 2021, they made it, they benefited from an injured Joel Embiid and basically the Ben Simmons falling apart in live action during that second round matchup. We saw the Portland Trailblazers be able to make it to the conference finals in 2018. It was possibly, could have been 2019, but ultimately, I do think the Pacers can be back in a similar position. Tyrese Halliburton is one of the best young players in the league, and he should only continue to develop. He dealt with a lot of injury problems throughout the second half of the season, so he should come back healthy. Speaking of injuries, they they lost Benedict Mathurin during the course of the regular season. For those of you who may not watch the Pacers all that much during the regular season, Mathurin is a really nice option for them. Spent a lot of time coming off of the bench. I'm curious to see, especially with the development of Nembhard in this postseason. I kind of feel like Mathurin would continue to come off the bench for them, but also at the same time, you could make a case that Andrew Nembhard could sort of find a six man of the year type of role coming off of the bench behind Halliburton, because he can clearly run the show when he's by himself. But it does sort of lead into conversations with TJ McConnell, where he and Miles Turner are both going to become unrestricted free agents after next season. So something to also consider when you're talking about how much money you're going to dish out, specifically more so to Obi Toppin over this offseason. But, on the note of Andrew Nembhard as well, thought that Kevin O'Connor from The Ringer made a very interesting comparison, and not to the same exact gravity, but he did sort of liken the run that Andrew Nembhard had in these final two games to Jalen Brunson when he was in the Western Conference Finals with the Dallas Mavericks in his third season. And early on in that postseason, he had to sort of step up for a couple games when Luka Doncic was dealing with a calf strain, and he erupted 40 points in one of those games, and this was sort of leading him into his Knicks career, that he was able to have this type of a performance in the postseason, show that he could potentially be a number one guy for them. And I thought that was sort of a pretty smart comparison there, where this was actually in 21-22, so it could have been Brunson's fourth year, but ultimately showing some potential from a guard who had success during college and is now in a position where I don't know if I'm ready to necessarily hand the keys over to a franchise, but somebody who can definitely be a prominent piece of this Indiana team moving forward. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section as to how the Pacers should act in the offseason. We're going to take our spot here, and back on the other side, I want to dive into the hockey playoffs. We saw the Dallas Stars take their rematch against the Edmonton Oilers last night, a pretty nice comeback win. So we're going to be diving into all of that. Stick with us, and we'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. want to move into a little bit of hockey here. We're going to come back to basketball briefly, but I want to talk about the game from last night between the Dallas Stars and the Edmonton Oilers, where we saw the Stars, after a very slow start, be able to come back in this game and ultimately notch a win to retake the series advantage, and doing so thanks to, in large part, the performance of their star player, Jason Robertson, where he was really impressive for him. We had seen him struggling from a goal-scoring standpoint for really large stretch games here, where he was unable to score in the previous games, but he ends up notching himself a hat-trick, a true hat-trick, and came through in some really big moments for the Stars, where they actually trailed this game 0-2 after the first period, where they were just sort of dominated thanks to the Oilers. We see when their offense is firing, it really revolves around Connor McDavid, who was incredible. He left his impression all over this first period, where he was able to notch himself an assist early on, shooting and sort of deflecting into the goal, and then he got a shot for himself to go down in this game as well. And like I mentioned, the Oilers just controlled it all the way throughout. When we went to intermission, Wayne Gretzky on the TNT cast was talking about how the Oilers are in a perfect position. The Stars, who are seen as a little bit more of a defense-predicated team, that they're going to have to ramp up their aggression, and when they do, there are going to be opportunities for the Oilers. But instead, when the Stars ramped up their aggression, they just took over this game, where it was, a dominant 10 to 15 minute stretch to open up this second quarter, and that is where Robertson started to get his, where we see him notch 2 goals in a 2.5 minute span. And part of the reason he was able to do so is because, like Gretzky said, we know that the Stars team does have a pretty nice defensive focus as well. And I thought that specifically it was that aggression and the forecheck that helped to make these goals possible. We saw Rupe Hintz. He had been injured since Game 4 of the Avalanche series, had missed the past 4 games. He made a great play for the Stars around the blue line, throwing a hit down to get Edmonton to cough up the ball, keep the possession in the offensive zone for the Stars. He ended up tracking down the loose puck as well behind the net and assisted to Robertson, who picked up the first of his 3 goals for the night. And like I mentioned, Robertson was just massive for them in this game after having this cold stretch for him from a goal-scoring standpoint. He talked about it after the game as this domino effect after getting his confidence back, and that's certainly what it looked like in this game. Like I mentioned, just 2.5 minutes later, he was able to get his second goal of the night, as well off of a couple rebound opportunities that Skinner coughed up. Now, we're going to sort of dive into Skinner as well and his performance as the Edmonton goalkeeper, but it was a really nice job of Robertson just sort of getting the lift off the backhand to sort of sneak one in the top corner and end up evening up this game. And the Stars weren't done there in the second period, where they scored their third goal in a 3 minute and 33 span with, again, another really nice forecheck opportunity where Jamie Benn kept it in the zone, chased down the puck behind the net, and relayed it to Stankoven, who hit Johnston for the leading goal. 3 straight for them, again, in that 3 minute and 33 span. Up to this point, the Oilers hadn't even had a shot on net in the second period, and the Stars had already stormed back and scored 3 goals in this period. Now, the Oilers did get themselves together a little bit more finally after settling in. McDavid broke the cold streak for them with at least a shot on net with 7:11 left in the second period. Again, first shot attempt of the period for them, shot on goal at least. And started putting some more pressure on Ottinger and actually ended up evening it up with the goal they scored with 42 and a half seconds left in the second period. Ottinger came out of the net. He tried to flip it down the boards to Thomas Harley, who he coughed up the puck, and ultimately before Ottinger was able to fully reestablish himself in the net, the Oilers ended up sneaking it by him. So we went into the third period with a tie game, but like I mentioned, Skinner just sort of felt shaky in this game, and Robertson was able to complete the hat trick by just sort of stuffing it through that left post where he was just kind of by himself, had no angle whatsoever on Skinner, and again, just sort of, there was a tiny little hole in the left. He snuck it by, almost banked it off of Skinner's back and into the goal, and that was, really the turning point of this game, where the Stars eventually get an empty netter to go late in this one, but Robertson, again, was absolutely massive for them, and on the other end, I think that a little bit of concern to come with Stuart Skinner, who has not been necessarily, he hasn't been bad, but he has not been the most reliable option for Edmonton, who I really like the Oilers and their chances as a whole, but can't necessarily feel great about them, considering the fact that I do think that they are the weakest goalie duo remaining in the NHL playoffs. Of course, he is sort of being compared with a lot of other stars in the playoffs that remain with Bobrovsky, Ottinger, and Shesterkin, but last night we saw really struggle, 21 shots against only 17 saves, allowed 4 of them to go in, just an 81% save percentage. We have seen the 26 goalies appear in the postseason so far, and obviously, some of them more playing time than others, so context is obviously important, but it is at least notable that he is 20th in terms of save percentage out of those 26 goalies that have played so far, 88.5%, which, just not necessarily a Stanley Cup ready number. It's very hard to win in the postseason if you don't have a goaltender playing at his best, and for Skinner, not that I think that it's completely over with him and that there's no way that he can pull himself back together, but I definitely don't see him on the same tier as those other goalies that I mentioned. Him, 88.5% save percentage if you look at the other guys that remain. Bobrovsky, 90%. Ottinger, 92, and Shesterkin, 92.5. So again, it's not like there is this extremely drastic gap between them, and we saw that Skinner had a pretty solid regular season for the most part, but earlier in the postseason, we also saw him get pulled for Calvin Pickard in one of those games. We've seen Pickard sort of be in start a couple of these games as well, I believe, and he's never really been the go-to guy necessarily. He had one season when he was with Colorado in 2015-16, I think it was, where it was a bad Colorado team, and he suffered a lot of losses in that season. But I just don't think that the Oilers necessarily have some tremendous options ahead of them, and they're going to have to be very reliant on their offense. It is worth noting that we still are yet to see a power play goal from either one of these teams in this series so far, and that is significant, I think, more so to the Oilers than it is to the Stars, where we've talked about on the show in the past that the special teams for Edmonton has been what has really carried them through a lot of the postseason so far, and that has sort of fallen apart for them, and it's going to be really difficult, I think, for them to be able to pull this one out. Now, I was on Garrison's show, the hockey podcast, last week, and at the time I was feeling obviously better about the Oilers than I currently am, but if there is any one thing you were going to point to in terms of the Oilers and why they might be in trouble, I think that it is the goalie situation. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. We are going to be taking our final break now, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be wrapping up the show by talking about the reports that have come out about the LA Clippers and their plans as to whether or not they're going to be signing Paul George, who is entering free agency. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Headed into our final segment of the day, and I want to sort of touch on the idea of whether or not the Clippers should be looking to re-sign Paul George in the offseason. He is a coming free agent. Paul George, of course, a multiple-time All-Star, has been a big piece for the Clippers over the past few seasons, but the Clippers just continue to sort of disappoint through these postseasons, and in large part it is because of the lack of other stars, specifically if you want to look at Kawhi Leonard. But ultimately, I think that when you sort of look at this situation, they decided to go out and extend Kawhi Leonard during the middle of the season when he was playing really well, a 3-year deal worth $152 million. And I understood at the time, Kawhi Leonard was having his best offense season at least since 2019, and efficiency-wise, possibly even better. It was a ton of fun to watch, but ultimately, what we continue to see with Kawhi is the lack of availability continues to hurt him, and it's extremely disappointing, but they already made the decision, and I don't blame them for committing at the time, especially with some somebody like Kawhi Leonard, who has maybe a little bit more of, a secluded personality, you could call it, where don't totally know what you're going to get out of him from a communication standpoint, that you want to lock him down as soon as possible. But now they are sort of stuck with this contract. And I don't say stuck as in it can't ever be a positive asset for them still, but they made the decision and they are committed to him long term. And it sounds like the Ringer has reported that they will not give Paul George the same contract, that they are looking to sign him for cheaper. And for Paul George, after sort of everything that has played out, especially, and it's not that Paul George necessarily has been tremendous for them in terms of postseason success during the past 2 years. They've only won three playoff games. They won 2 against the Suns last year, I want to say. But I don't know. Regardless, Paul George, I think that ultimately when it comes to how he's been able to play for them, he's at least been available, and he was a massive part of them being able to make the Western Conference Finals during the bubble after Kawhi Leonard went down. So I can understand why he feels like, again, in a pretty watered-down free agency class, he could want to go out and get his. So I think that ultimately for the Clippers, this is probably headed to a departure that could go out and get him. I don't know if it's necessarily financially applicable right now, but the Lakers obviously are always in contention for stars. The 76ers have already been interested in it as well. So Paul George is going to have options. I think a fit that I personally would really like is potentially with an Orlando Magic team that has these forwards already that are really good so far, but there is a lack of spacing right now. now and maybe need a little bit more of a closer, although I do think that Paolo can eventually become him. But I don't think that Paul George is too on-ball dominant that he would stunt the development. Specifically, I'm looking at Paolo Banchero. Franz Wagner I like a lot, but I also, I don't think that I'm quite as high on him of being a potential, top 15, top 20 player that a lot of other people are. So let me know how you feel about it in the comment section. But seems like we are headed towards a divorce here. But I do want to quickly address a comment here we have from Lil Fettuccini. Can Minnesota win at least one game in the series? I do think so. You look at the way that the Pacers were able to, stay alive in their matchup last night against the Celtics, and definitely a more drastic talent discrepancy, I would say, between Indiana and Boston and what is going on in the Western Conference with Dallas and Minnesota. So, there's just a level of desperation that you can't necessarily fake. The Timberwolves are going to go out there and leave it all out on the court. I also feel like the loss of Derek Lively, who is going to be out for this game, we have seen two players in Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, and I would be curious to sort of look at the combined contracts of the two of them versus Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert, and just looking at the difference in production where, Dallas's big men have been much better than Minnesota and are making a fraction of the price as the Twin Towers in Minnesota. So, the Timberwolves, now it's going to be difficult. The Mavericks do have very good home court advantage, so it's definitely not going to be easy. But again, I do think that when you come to these types of situations, and especially in the NBA in 2024, the level of three-point variance has never been more drastic as well. So all it takes is some Timberwolves to get hot. That being said, they had an extremely hot Naz Reid game in Game 2, and they dropped that one. But I think that the Timberwolves are going to be able to fight in this game. Anthony Edwards, we have seen him have his, I would say that he flashed in the third quarter of Game 3 of him being able to get to the rim at will. And even if you go back to Game 2 as well, I thought that down the stretch he was getting downhill more and he's getting some free throw attempts. Removing Derek Lively from that equation, at least for this game, I think the Timberwolves are an extremely talented team and that they can get a game out of this. But I still, coming back from 0-3 is just about a, unthinkable task as things currently stand. But I think that, again, the Timberwolves have the potential to make this a little bit more interesting, but the Mavericks at this point, are they going to be the first team to blow a 3-0 lead in NBA history? I kind of doubt it, but I am curious right now, and sort of to answer your question, I want to sort of briefly look at the odds of what we're looking at for tonight's game, where the Mavericks are 1.5 point favorites at home, which is pretty interesting. That sort of means that you'd have to imagine Vegas sort of thinks that the Timberwolves are favorites in this game, but the home court advantage sort of swings the points a few ways in a few points in their favor. But ultimately, I think that the Timberwolves can stay alive tonight, but it is definitely going to be a tall task for them, especially with the youth talent that they sort of rely on to be able to pull back this comeback. But I hope for Anthony Edwards' sake that he is able to have at least one more sort of star performance, because Towns has struggled far more than he has. Edwards has definitely been quiet over the course of this series so far, and I kind of hate the way that the discourse has happened around him, where he was excellent to begin the playoffs and all of a sudden he's Michael Jordan, and put these extremely high expectations on him. And for a 22-year-old, that was just never really going to be sustainable, especially like we've talked about throughout the, really going back to the regular season as well. Timberwolves, outside of Anthony Edwards, don't have a ton of creators offensively, especially when Karl Anthony Towns is sort of falling apart the way he is. But I mean, let me know in the comments if you feel any differently. Again, one game I don't think is too outrageous for them to be able to steal back, but I guess sort of just coming back full circle on this idea about Paul George and the Clippers. This is a situation for LA where they're going to be moving into their new arena next season. They are hoping to have a little bit of star power sort of behind them to try and steal back, some fans living as the secondary team in a market in LA where the Lakers have obviously dominated the entire state essentially, and that the Clippers are trying to make a name for themselves heading into next year. They're going to want to have names to put up on the posters and such, and Kawhi Leonard is one of them. If they're not going to be willing to sign Paul George, which I don't really know why not, because at this point it feels like it's kind of all or nothing for the Clippers. This experiment has not been successful up to this point, and I'm not really sure what else you're going to do. Obviously, financially, it is more complicated than that, but especially if they're going to go out and pay James Harden, which seems pretty likely, I would say that it's not a massive mistake. Like, again, I understand you are trying to, sell tickets, and the business aspect of it has to some degree, for the Clippers headed into next season, take just as much precedent as the actual production on the court. But the Clippers don't have a winning recipe right now, and one of the most cursed franchises in the history of American sports is just continuing to be in this really tough position. But let me know what your thoughts are as to what the Clippers should do in the offseason. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back tomorrow streaming every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on weekdays. So we will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to